Welcome back, I'm that Chemist, and today we're going to be deciding which incapacitating agent is the most effective. Let's get started with Agent 15. Agent 15 is also known as BZ, and it was one of the chemicals tested in the Edgewood arsenal, as it has the code EA2277. This chemical is an antagonist of the muscarinic acetylcholine receptors, and it produces a syndrome with effects known as the anticholinergic toxidrome. Some of the effects of this include both psychological and physiological effects, and the real takeaway is that it incapacitates the person through a state of delirium characterized by cognitive dysfunction, hallucinations, and inability to perform basic tasks. So basically, when you get exposed to this stuff, you're just completely out of it and you become useless. It was originally invented in 1951, and around this time, the United States military began investigating it, along with a bunch of other possible non-lethal psychoactive substances that would be potentially able to incapacitate people. Some of these substances include psychedelic drugs like LSD and THC, but they also include drugs like ketamine and phencyclidine. In addition to these, they looked at several other compounds such as fentanyl and other opioids, in addition to other compounds like BZ. BZ is just one of several different compounds that were found to have similar activity, and while many of these were made, BZ is the one that is most commonly discussed. Eventually, BZ was weaponized for delivery in the M44 generator cluster and the M43 cluster bomb. Now, these never saw any actual use, and all of the stocks were destroyed in 1989 as part of the downsizing of the US chemical warfare program. During the Edgewood Arsenal experiments, James Ketchum mentions that 24 of these compounds, including BZ and analogs, were given to 1,800 test subjects. Now, these test subjects were quote-unquote volunteers. I think you can decide on your own what you want to think about that. So BZ, how effective is it? It's extremely effective. So effective that its use had to be discontinued. While some of the effects of these compounds are short-lived, there can be long-term consequences, and as these have been outlawed, more or less, I think it goes without saying that most of these shouldn't be used lightly. BZ, as a compound that no longer is used and hasn't actually seen any combat use due to concerns of using chemical weapons, I think this one could go right into S tier. It's extremely effective to the point that nobody's using it because we're afraid of what could happen if we all start using it. Absolutely terrifying. At this point, we should probably discuss what an incapacitating agent is. An incapacitating agent, as defined by the US Department of Defense, is an agent that produces temporary physiological or mental effects, or both, which render individuals incapable of concerted effort in the performance of their assigned duties. It describes an agent which renders a person unable to harm themselves or others, regardless of consciousness. So these chemicals need to interrupt what the person's doing, but that doesn't necessarily mean they need to be unconscious. They might be dissociating, they might be screaming, there's pepper spray in my eyes, but the real takeaway is that they're not doing the thing that we want them to stop doing. Maybe that's fighting back, maybe that's hurting themselves, and depending on what it is they're doing, there might be different approaches which are more beneficial to others. For example, if you're getting surgery, hopefully the doctor won't pepper spray you. If you've ever been pepper sprayed by a doctor, I'd love to hear it in the comments. Now, the next compound I want to talk about is EA2233, also known as DMHP or dimethylheptylpyran. DMHP is an analog of THC, and this is actually a mixture of compounds. Each of the spots where you see a single methyl group sticking off, these are spots where there could be chiral centers, so certain isomers are going to be more potent than others. This is an analog of THC that already exists naturally in cannabis, although the different isomers of DMHP were synthesized and isolated and were ultimately explored in the Edgewood Arsenal experiments as possible non-lethal incapacitating agents. Compared to THC, this compound is much more potent and the effects are longer lasting. And on the test subjects that were given this compound, the effects lasted as long as 2 to 3 days, which is pretty insane compared to something like THC. Now, in terms of the different non-lethal incapacitating agents that were investigated at EA, compounds such as EA2233 were among the most promising compounds that came out of their research. Unfortunately, because it was deemed to have an unsafe therapeutic index, relative to BZ for use in military operations, its study was abandoned in favor of BZ. So this is another fairly effective one, so effective that it was one of the finalists in the research at the Edgewood Arsenal, although it wasn't as effective as BZ due to its therapeutic index. I still have reservations about whether or not the therapeutic index here is a fair weight, as I'm sure people would prefer to be exposed to cannabinoids over antagonists of acetylcholine receptors. I think it's fair that we've put both of those compounds into S tier. Next, we have PAVA, also known as nonivamide. This compound resembles capsaicin as it's a capsaicinoid. This has been used as a food additive, and it's the most common active ingredient in most pepper sprays. In general, capsaicinoids are chemical irritants, which produce a sensation of burning when tissues come into contact with them. Quite oftentimes, people use these for self-defense. You might see this being used in riots or protests, although it's more often used in self-defense against an assailant or a potential pest such as a bear. Are there more effective things against bears than PAVA? Absolutely. And depending on where you live, you might have different options available. I think it's fairly effective, and given that it's just an analog of capsaicin, as long as you're not exposed to really, really high amounts of this, I think this is fairly effective. It's extremely unpleasant when you're exposed to it, but your body's able to break it down and you'll survive. Now, that being said, you shouldn't go and eat like 10 grams of this stuff every day. It's probably not wise. But just because you shouldn't eat 10 grams of it every day doesn't mean it's not safe. So this is a relatively good compound as well. I think this one can probably go into S tier as well, as it's the one that's most commonly used. I think we've settled in terms of which one's the most effective. Now, so far with these three compounds, because they can be dispersed in the air, they're fairly effective because they're fairly potent. Now, if we have something else here like GHB, this one's not as potent for something that you can just disperse in the air, but it's still fairly effective. So GHB is gamma hydroxybutyric acid, and it's actually a naturally occurring neurotransmitter, although it's also a depressant drug. GHB is well known for being a party drug that people will use personally, although occasionally it's also used by people who want to take advantage of others. When people are recovering from exposure to GHB, they might have an impaired ability to recall events that happened while they were intoxicated. So this is a chemical that people often slip into drinks, for example. As such, it's understandable why it's a controlled substance. Since relatively large amounts of this are needed compared to some of the other incapacitating agents here, and since it has to get into the body before it can incapacitate someone in a large amount, I think this one's not as good. It ends in a B, so why don't we put it into B tier? Next, we have phenacetyl chloride, which is also known as CN or mace. Sometimes people refer to any pepper spray as mace, but there's a clear distinction between mace and capsaicin. Here we have phenacetyl chloride, it's alpha-chloroacetophenone, and the target of tear gases like phenacetyl chloride is the TRPA1 receptor. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later on. This was another one that was researched quite early on, although due to its toxicity, it was eventually supplanted by CS gas. Quite often, in cases where you'd want to use mace, pepper spray is equally effective, so you'll either see pepper spray or CS gas used instead. Phenacetyl chloride's fairly effective, but overall, compared to some of the other ones, it's not as great. It isn't as effective at controlling riots, and it doesn't have that much persistence. So why don't we put it into C tier? Next, we have chloroform. Chloroform is the classic chemical people think of when you're trying to incapacitate someone. People always talk about getting quote-unquote chloroformed, but the amount of chloroform vapor you'd have to breathe in to actually get knocked out is quite drastic. Does that mean it's impossible? No, it's possible. And it's even been used in cough medicine historically. Here's a picture of what one of those bottles look like now. Several of the ingredients in this bottle would definitely be involved with becoming incapacitated. While chloroform is relatively weak, it's still active as an anesthetic, a euphoriant, a sedative, and it can even be ingested, hence why it was in the cough medicine. Compared to other intoxicants, it's purportedly weak, and it's a really common solvent that we use almost all the time in organic chemistry. So chloroform is a relatively weak one. I think we could put it into like E tier, because it's just not that effective. Here we have xylyl bromide. Xylene is just a benzene with two methyl groups, and oftentimes if you're working with xylene as a solvent, you'll just have a mixture of different di-substituted benzenes. So when we have this weird line sticking off the ring, that just means that the thing sticking off the ring can occur in different positions of the ring, so it's a mixture. Xylyl bromide is an irritant and a lacrimator. It's been incorporated into chemical weapons since the early months of World War I. The first time this was used was by the German forces firing 18,000 of these at Russian positions in 1915 in the Battle of Bolimau, and because it was the winter, the attack was a complete failure, as the weather was too cold to effectively make an aerosol. There was another attack using this chemical in March of 1915, but this was also unsuccessful. Now, if you happen to be a chemist doing work in the lab, you might have worked with benzyl bromides before, and you'll know how unpleasant they are. So all things considered, these did have potential, but they didn't see as much use as we might have expected. For that reason, I think we can put it into D tier, because it never quite made it. Now let's talk about capsaicin. This is the molecule that makes chili peppers spicy, although there are other capsaicinoids in the pepper that make them spicy. Capsaicinoids, as I mentioned earlier, are chemical irritants. This is just typically used for self-defense, or for seasoning dishes. Capsaicin's fairly effective, much as Pava is, so we can put this one into S tier. CS gas. This also has the code EA1779 as another chemical that was explored at the Edgewood Arsenal. It's the defining component of tear gas that almost everybody uses. Exposure to CS gas causes a burning sensation and tearing of the eyes to the point that you can't keep your eyes open anymore. It also causes a burning irritation of the mucous membranes of the nose, mouth, and throat, resulting in profuse coughing, nasal mucus discharge, disorientation, difficulty breathing, resulting in the incapacitation of the target. Now, while CS is occasionally claimed to be non-toxic, it still causes severe pulmonary damage and can also cause significant damage to the heart and liver. We actually have a compilation on the channel discussing CS gas, as there was someone in the Discord who was exposed to this in their training, and they had a really crazy story involving CS gas. If that sounds interesting to you, I'll include a link to that in the description. CS gas is what's actively used in tear gas. I think it's pretty clear this is another S tier chemical. MPK. This also has an EA number, and it's usually used as a solvent for lacrimator formulations containing CR or CS gas. Apparently on its own, it's still effective against dogs. So like if you needed this as a self-defense spray, it might work a little bit against dogs, but apparently it isn't that potent. So usually when this is used, it has to be used in combination with other incapacitating agents, and so its main function is mostly as a solvent. The only places where you really see this in CR or CS gas for personal defense is in Russia or the Ukraine, and it's basically unknown everywhere else. I think this is probably like a D tier chemical because it can still be sprayed on people as a deterrent. How effective is it? I don't think we can really make a fair judgment, but compare that to something like chloroform, which you really have to force into someone to make them get affected by it. I think it's clear that MPK is probably worse. Next, we have ethanol. Ethanol can be a really effective incapacitating agent, but it depends on your target. It probably goes without saying, this is one that I'm sure almost all of you will recognize. You may or may not know that in chemistry, ethanol is a solvent, and one of the things people try to dissolve with ethanol is their problems, although the solubility of problems in ethanol is fairly low. Ethanol does all sorts of things in the body. It's a central nervous system depressant, and its main effects are through its activity as a positive allosteric GABA A modulator. It does quite a lot of stuff in the body, and you usually need gram amounts of ethanol to get any sort of effect. So compare that to something like one of these really potent agents that are used as tear gases. There's just no comparison with ethanol. If you're going to try and get someone incapacitated with ethanol vapor, it would require so much, and they would know exactly what's going on. It's not going to be that effective. Ethanol overall is fairly low, but if the person becoming incapacitated can be convinced to drink a large amount of ethanol, maybe they'll just incapacitate themselves. Ethanol is another fairly weak one. Why don't we put it into E tier, which is appropriate, because it starts with an E. So the next one is sneeze mace. Now, if you look up sneeze mace, you probably won't find this unless you find some like weird D&D item, which is like a mace of sneezing or something. And I haven't seen this compound discussed anywhere to my knowledge. So the interesting thing about this one is it causes intense sneezing. And one of the undergraduate researchers in our lab was working with this, and he tried to convince me that this compound's a sneezing agent. Is there any such thing as that? And I'm like, there is no such thing as a sneezing agent. That's so dumb. I've never heard of anything like that. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you're just weird. Maybe you're allergic to it. Fast forward a few months, I had another undergraduate in the lab who was trying to reproduce this chemistry done by this other researcher, and lo and behold, they also are sneezing like crazy. And I was in close proximity to them when they were working on the scale with this, weighing it out, and I also was sneezing like crazy. And that's when it hit me. They were right. This is a sneezing agent. So I'm curious as to what possible activity could be causing this, but it's definitely a remarkable compound, and if any of you have experienced this before, I'd be interested to hear about it in the comments. If I had to compare this to something like black pepper, it's way more intense because it can cause sneezing several meters away, and this is just a powder when you're weighing it out. It's not that volatile, so it's surprising that it has the effect that it does. Sneeze mace is a weird one. If someone was sneezing hard enough, maybe they'd be incapacitated, but I think we can probably put that one right into F tier. Next, we have CR gas. This also has an EA number from the Edgewood Arsenal. It was originally developed by the British Ministry of Defense as a riot control agent in the late 1950s and early 1960s. This is another lacrimator, which causes tearing and is just unpleasant for all of your mucous membranes, and it's about 6 to 10 times more powerful than CS gas. This is another really, really potent one, and this can go into S tier. It's also got this really interesting structure, which is pretty cool in my opinion. Here we have LSD. This also has an Edgewood Arsenal number. And the report from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission mentions that 741 soldiers were exposed to LSD as a part of the Edgewood Arsenal. Now that's way more people than I would have guessed would be necessary for testing. I thought that it would have been sort of the order of like 5 to 10 people, maybe 20 at the extreme. So I was quite surprised to hear 741 people underwent testing. LSD has this core, which is called the ergoline core. It's one of the classical psychedelics, which means that it has activity as an agonist at the 5-HT2A receptor, which is the serotonin 2A receptor. It also has activity at other serotonin receptors, which might contribute to its activity. As an incapacitating agent, it has a fairly high potency of sub-milligram quantities, and its effects can last quite long in comparison to other psychedelics such as psilocybin. LSD is another fairly potent one, although it's still necessary to expose the target to the LSD, which likely means some sort of close contact is required. I would say this is another B tier chemical because it isn't typically active through skin exposure. Some sort of ingestion or introduction to the inside of the body is usually required. Next, we have halothane. This isn't really a chemical that people use to incapacitate people unless we're talking about surgery. This chemical is actually an ozone depleter, and it's less common in developed countries as there's more modern anesthetics that have lower overall toxicity. Unfortunately, it causes fulminant hepatitis in 1 in 10,000 people, the hepatitis being inflammation of the liver. This likely occurs due to the conversion of halothane into trifluoroacetic acid, which can be toxic to the liver. And while it's only 1 in 10,000, it's better if we can get that number as small as possible. So this is an anesthetic. That means you have to put it right into their lungs in concentrated amounts. So it's not too effective for instance, riot control. So is it effective for surgery? Sure. Is it effective for controlling a riot? No. Can it incapacitate? Yes. But it requires direct contact, so I think we can put this one also into E tier. Maybe this one actually belongs in D tier, because compared to something like chloroform, this is just much better suited for anesthesia. Here's an interesting one. Adamsite, also known as DM. I know after recording this episode, my DMs are going to be full of Adamsite references. This is a riot control agent that causes violent vomiting. This is a vomiting agent. After a latency period of about 5 to 10 minutes, irritation of the eyes, lungs, and mucous membranes develops, followed by a headache, nausea, and persistent vomiting. It's been used in the United States before. It was used against the Bonus Army, demonstrators including veterans of the US Army who wanted to redeem their service bonus certificates early. That's right. An arsenic-containing chemical was used against protesters who had served the US government. I personally find that fairly upsetting. Another upsetting fact is that when this happened in 1932 in DC, the use of this chemical caused the death and serious injury of several children who had accompanied their parents to the protests. That's fairly awful. A vomiting agent is a fairly unpleasant idea. I think this one can go into A tier, and it's fairly sketchy to see arsenic in an organic molecule. The next chemical is chloral hydrate. This is basically an aldehyde, but water's reacted with it, and as such, this is a hydrated aldehyde. These normally aren't too stable, but because of this trichloromethyl group, it's electron withdrawing, and that stabilizes this hydrate. It's a somewhat antiquated sedative/hypnotic drug that used to be used for surgery, and in severe cases of insomnia, it's occasionally still used to induce sleep. Most of the time when trying to induce sleep, usually barbiturates or benzodiazepines have been used, and historically, this has been another chemical that people use to lace people's drink in a practice known as slipping a Mickey. A drink spiked with chloral hydrate is called a Mickey Finn, and that's because in December 1903, there was this guy named Michael Mickey Finn who managed the Lone Star Saloon, and he was accused of using these knockout drops to incapacitate and rob some of his customers. It's interesting to note that chloral hydrate is actually a prodrug to trichloroethanol, and its activity is through the enhancement of the GABA receptor complex, similar to other drugs like barbiturates. So chloral hydrate is another one that requires close proximity. I think this can go in the same tier as ethanol, although it might be slightly more effective than ethanol. Here we have carfentanil. This is an opioid. In a previous tier list, I erroneously referred to some non-natural opioids as opiates. I'm going to correct the record now. An opiate is a drug that targets the opioid receptors, but is naturally occurring, while opioids are synthetic or non-natural opioid-type drugs, which target opioid receptors. So carfentanil is an opioid. Normally, this is seen in anesthesia for large animals. Usually, this is in the form of tranquilizer darts. Some people have used carfentanil as a recreational drug since it's highly active at the mu opioid receptor. And in the Moscow theater hostage crisis in 2002, it was found that carfentanil and remifentanil were present in the clothing from 2 of the British survivors. They also found it in the urine of a 3rd survivor. Ultimately, the team concluded that the Russian military had used a mist of carfentanil and remifentanil to subdue the hostage takers. Unfortunately, all of the people in there were also exposed, and because the Russian military didn't disclose what chemicals they used to the paramedics, 125 people were exposed to this and they died due to respiratory failure. Pretty awful. This was able to be aerosolized. It was used as an incapacitating agent. Therefore, I think we can put this into A tier. I think it's fairly effective as an incapacitating agent, although if you're incapacitating someone with this one, it's fairly easy to overdo it, and you definitely don't want to overdo that. Otherwise, you lose control. And I think with most of these agents, what you're really trying to do is keep control. If there's a riot, you're trying to get control. If someone's misbehaving, you're trying to get control. And if while you're in charge, you end up accidentally killing someone, you're not going to be in control for very long. Here we have rohypnol, also known as roofies. You've probably heard roofies mentioned at least 100 times in your life, and you've never seen the structure of roofies until right now. Now, while roofies are famous for making people forget, I hope you remember that you came across roofies on this channel. Rohypnol is a benzodiazepine, which is used to treat severe insomnia and assists with anesthesia. It works by enhancing GABA at GABA receptors. Roofies are so famous, I probably don't even need to tell you about them. They're famous for being used to take advantage of people. Benzodiazepines in general get a pretty bad rep, as oftentimes people become dependent on benzodiazepines and they have really severe withdrawal symptoms. This is another chemical that you need fairly large amounts of, and you need to get it into their body. This is really hard to talk about without giving you instructions on how to roofie people. This is another chemical that must be ingested to take effect, so it's going to be rated lower. I think this can go probably into D tier, as it's got a bad reputation and it's got a history. I think the fact that basically everyone listening to this has heard of roofies at some point really highlights the cultural significance of it. I think for that reason alone, we should probably just move it into C tier, because it's got a reputation. Here we have a barbiturate. I haven't talked about barbiturates too much on the channel. This is one called sodium thiopental. Sodium thiopental is a rapid onset barbiturate. It's used as an anesthetic, but it's mostly been supplanted by propofol. We'll be talking about propofol in a few minutes here. It was also previously used for lethal injections in the United States, but the manufacturer wasn't thrilled about their drug being used for that purpose. So consequently, the manufacturer stopped manufacturing the drug, and the European Union banned the export of this drug for that reason. This one is another one that requires introduction into the body in an invasive way, so I think we could put this with ethanol and chloral hydrate into E tier. Another noteworthy chemical from the Edgewood arsenal is PCP, phenylcyclohexylpiperidine, also known as phencyclidine. I think the first time I came across PCP was through some friend mentioning it to me as a kid, and then eventually I watched an episode of The Whitest Kids You Know, which had a sketch called Gallon of PCP. I'll include a link to that sketch in the description because it's a classic from The Whitest Kids You Know. PCP is a dissociative anesthetic with historical use, although some people have used it recreationally. There's actually an episode of Hamilton Morris's show, Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia, which is dedicated to the discussion of PCP. PCP is an NMDA receptor antagonist similar to ketamine. and PCP is more potent than ketamine, and its effects are longer lasting. Consequently, a therapeutic dose would be more likely to make a patient psychotic for as long as possibly a few days. So some development went into other analogs which were less potent and shorter acting, which is how we get ketamine. PCP, again, you need to get into the body, fairly potent. We can probably put it into D tier because it is quite challenging to conduct your duties while incapacitated. Ketamine. This is another dissociative anesthetic used medically for the induction and maintenance of anesthesia. It's also seen some early use in ketamine-assisted therapy for treatment-resistant depression, and as with PCP, it's an antagonist of the NMDA receptor, and it also sees some use recreationally. Ketamine is about as effective as PCP, so why don't we put it into D tier. Fentanyl is another opioid. This is the one more often used in surgery, as it's extremely potent as an opioid for the management of pain. Compared with traditional opiates, fentanyl and related compounds are really potent, making an overdose a serious concern. When this is used by trained medical professionals, it's extremely safe, but it can pose a serious risk outside of clinical preparations. One of the major concerns is that street drugs might be contaminated by fentanyl, and since the drug is active at sub-milligram quantities, overdosing becomes a real concern. So fentanyl is fairly effective, as we've seen stuff like this get used in settings such as that Moscow theater crisis. It's extremely concerning. So fentanyl is definitely an effective incapacitating agent, but again, the person who's incapacitated might be permanently incapacitated, which is typically not desired. Next, we have propofol. Propofol is colloquially known as milk of amnesia because it's milky and white. It's a short-acting medication that results in a decreased level of consciousness and a lack of memory for events. Its uses include the starting and maintenance of general anesthesia, and it gets used in a few other procedures. I personally was given propofol when I got all of my wisdom teeth removed, and the experience was quite odd. It was like I was given it, and I stopped being aware of what was going on, and several hours later, I was sitting in a room that was different than the room I was in. I remember briefly when they moved me between rooms. It felt like it could have been an eternity or just a few moments that I was sitting in that room before a family member came to collect me. After we left the room, suddenly we were in the elevator. Suddenly we were down the elevator, and there was this store that sold rocks. I was like, oh, rocks. I love rocks. I want to get some rocks at this rock store. And the family member that was with me was like, we can go to this place another time to get rocks. I'm like, okay, fine. And the fact that I agreed to not go to the rock store is how you know there was something wrong with me. It turned out that a couple days later, we were in the area again, and that was not a rock store. It was a bookstore, and they just happened to have a couple rocks in the display. Yeah. Now, while the memory of all of that stuff occurring was suppressed, I had this moment later in the night when I was sitting on the couch where like the entire day flashed before my eyes, and I had the sensation of all of the movements that the surgeon was doing in my mouth flash before my eyes in the matter of a few seconds. And it was like the whole day flashed before my eyes, and it was quite unsettling. Propofol is also the medication that Michael Jackson OD'd on, and people who've administered this to themselves have overdosed and passed away in many occasions. Propofol has several different mechanisms of action, but it's believed that its primary activity is through potentiating the GABA A receptor. Propofol is fairly effective, but it needs to be given in an IV, so it's not too practical aside from surgery. This can go into E tier. Next up, we have chloroacetone. Chloroacetone is a relatively simple one. It's usually a building block in synthetic chemistry, and it's been used as a tear gas in World War I. It causes severe eye pain and irritation, and its effects can last for hours. I think because this is such a simple one, and it's made from acetone, which is literally everywhere, it raises greater concerns. It's so accessible that I think that adds to its potential as an incapacitating agent. Now, that being said, it's not used very frequently anymore, but I think this is at least a solid A tier chemical still. Fairly spooky. Now, that being said, it's not that toxic, but it's just so readily available, and it's still fairly volatile. Here's a really obscure one that I didn't see mentioned anywhere on the internet. This chemical is known as DIM, diamine, and it was mentioned in that really spooky book that we mentioned in the nerve agent tier list. The nerve agent tier list video is actually the most popular video on the channel so far, and I'm glad to hear that you guys really enjoyed it. I couldn't find out too much in terms of the activity of this one, other than it probably targets the same receptor as the other tear gases do. It's an older riot control agent, and I couldn't find out too much about this one. There are some numbers given from the spooky book, and it's claimed overall to have an effectiveness as a riot control agent of 7.1. So I think this is a fairly middle of the road one. I think we can probably put it into A tier though, because it's still listed in the Spooky Book, and all of the chemicals listed as lacrimators in the Spooky Book should probably be treated quite seriously. Next we have BBC. This is not the BBC from the UK, it's bromobenzyl cyanide. Bromobenzyl cyanide is a lacrimator which was implemented in World War I, and it's reported to have a pungent odor of sour fruit. And, get this, a sweet taste. It was once used in riot control and training exercises, but it's so toxic that it reduced its frequency of use. Most of the time, it's just been replaced with CS gas and other incapacitating agents. Now, a couple people in the Discord thought that this abbreviation was rather odd. I'm not totally sure why. Anyway, the way that most tear gases work is by their activity at the TRPA1 receptor. This receptor is involved with a lot of tears, and it's also known as the wasabi receptor. Just imagine what several molecules of tear gases could do to a poor, unexpecting TRPA1 receptor. This is another one that's fairly effective. I think it belongs in S tier. It's an effective incapacitating agent. I would definitely not want to get exposed to bromobenzyl cyanide. Last but not least, we have chloropicrin. The other name for chloropicrin is PS, and it's also used as a broad-spectrum antimicrobial fungicide, herbicide, insecticide, and nematicide. It happens to be a potent riot control agent, as it's a strong irritant affecting the eyes, throat, and skin. It's also another vomiting agent, a choking agent, and most agencies have actually banned its use in riot control due to its severe irritating nature. The most frustrating part about chloropicrin is that its name comes from its original discovery route. It was discovered through the treatment of picric acid with bleach, sodium hypochlorite. Different methods are used nowadays, but as it was derived from picric acid, hence it was named chloropicrin. We can put this one into S tier because this is another really awful chemical that you do not want to get exposed to. So I hope you've enjoyed this tier list. If you haven't seen the nerve agent tier list yet, that one's got some pretty crazy chemicals that I don't think have even been seen on YouTube before this point. If you haven't seen it yet, make sure you check it out. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have a great day.